Ladies and gentlemen, would you give a round of applause for my son, the youngest of the Lion's Pride, Lieutenant Quentin Roosevelt.
Welcome to Sagamore Hill. These woods, these plains, and these coulees were my home. And it is wonderful to have you all here today. I haven't been back in a while. My sister-in-law was asked about her first stay at Sagamore Hill. She said, "It was absolute madness. Nothing in my upbringing could have prepared me for such a thing." She said that at every moment of all day, there was something going on. Someone was playing a game, someone was visiting, and someone was climbing a tree. At midnight, she thought that it would have ended hours before. And at midnight, everyone would retire to their rooms. At this moment of silence, she had a moment of peace, which was suddenly broken by the sound of everyone remembering that story or vignette that they had forgotten to tell everyone during the day, and everyone ran out into the hall screaming at the top of their lungs. After a very short sleep, it all began at 6 a.m. again. And it was a wonderful place to grow up. I recall another time my older brother, Ted Jr., received a new rifle as a gift. And he thought he would take it and shoot it. And he went down to the beach where we had a beach house. And he put his target against the wall of the beach house. And he fired away his gun, and his gun was almost as loud as that motorcycle. Unbeknownst, the bullets had gone through the beach house and through my father's swimming suit. Later in the week, my father and my mother and some of their friends took a swim. And he turned around to grab something out of his bag, and he revealed far too much president. Wonderful times here. I recall 124 years ago today. It was July 4th, 1900. My father had just been nominated to be Vice President of the United States, Republican nomination. He was on his way home. We children very much wanted to shoot off our fireworks, but we had to wait for Father. We went into the barn, gathered our fireworks, brought them to the house. My mother said there was enough gunpowder to blow the house into the bay. And out from the northwest, a storm cloud began to blow in, and it threatened the success of our events. We were afraid that we were going to get rained out that night. And fortunately, the storm blew away. At around 6 p.m., my father was in this house with reporters, and he said, gentlemen, the rain is going to save the house from fire and explosion. But he said, as for the children, we'll have to trust in Providence. Fortunately, no Roosevelt children were harmed that night. 8 p.m., we began lighting into the night, and Sagamore Hill was covered with lanterns and fireworks. It was a wonderful place to grow up. I also grew up in the White House, however. Many of my escapades in the White House are told as in Washington, D.C. and New York newspapers, where we were given the name the White House Gang. I'm sure you can come across many of those stories. A president, however, cannot live in the White House for forever. My cousin Franklin tried. We moved out in 1909, and where I continued education at Groton Preparatory School, where I excelled. And then in 1915, I enrolled in Harvard College. It was not yet a university. While I was at Harvard, I was very aware of the conflict that was raging across the sea. To prepare for entrance into the conflict, I was in the Harvard ROTC, and I spent my summers in military preparedness camps. On April 7th, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson was addressing Congress with a declaration of war. I, that day, addressed my dean with a request for leave of absence. I was not to remain studying books at Harvard College while my brothers and compatriots fought. As Father told you earlier, I very much love aviation, and I'm loving these airplanes today. I don't know about you. They're a little faster than my airplane. But I wanted to be a fighter pilot. Inheriting my father's bad eyesight, I had to memorize the eye chart. I was admitted into flight school, and I trained in Mineola, very close to here. After the war, the field in which I trained was renamed to Roosevelt Field, and now you can go and see Roosevelt Field Shopping Center. That is where I trained. I much preferred it there when there were planes rather than purses, I might tell you. About 10 years after I trained there, a certain Charles Lindbergh made the first transatlantic flight across, and he landed in Paris, but he started at Roosevelt Field, my namesake. On my last night in this house, in June of 1917, I was laying in my bed, and I heard the door open, and it was my mother. She had come to tuck me in. Even though I was a soldier going off to war, and even though I was 19 years old, and even though I was a fighter pilot, I was still her baby. On the troop ship, she slipped bread and treats into my bag. Unfortunately, we would never meet again. When I landed in Europe, Europe was a deadly and changed place. All the women walked around the streets in Paris with a gaunt look in their eye. The men were either wearing a military uniform or were missing a limb, an eye, or the morale. I was initially assigned to be a supply officer. This was very frustrating. I wanted a front lines position. That's why I'd gone to Europe. I did not go to Europe to supply the front lines. I went to Europe to fight on the front lines. And after 12 months in Europe, I was finally given a front lines position. When I arrived on the front lines, it was a deadly place. The Germans had been flying since 1914, 1915, and we pilots were new to combat. The Germans had superior aircraft. We were flying the Newport 28, the plane the Frenchmen would not fly. It was the objective of the Wilson administration to send the men over and then the supplies. We were left at the mercy of what supplies we could find. I was often left going across French countryside to find supplies on a motorcycle. I would commandeer it. Friends, a commandeer is a synonym for steal. I can recall my first patrol in enemy territory. I was flying about with two other American pilots, and a large piece of shrapnel ripped through my wing. If it had gone through my fuselage or me, it would have been the end of my life. I recall on another occasion, when a faulty engine left, I drew away from formation. I was left vulnerable and alone, and suddenly a shadow flashed across my fuselage. And I looked up, to my terror, it was a German pilot. In flight school, we were taught the saying, beware the Hun and the sun. Oftentimes, pilots would hide within the sun's rays and dive out at you because you cannot look directly in the rays of the sun. Fortunately, he must not have seen me because he continued along in his flight path. I was not always the victim and the hunted in World War I. I could recall on another patrol, I was with two other Americans, and we were flying about our sector. But again, I found myself separated. This time I cannot blame a faulty engine, perhaps a short attention span. I looked off in the distance after a half hour of flying, and instead of turning around, I thought I'd fly around and look around a bit. I had a full tank of gas. It's not like there's a war on. I went off, and in another half hour passed. In the distance, I saw two aircraft, and I assumed that they were Americans, for they did not try and attack me. I put my plane to full speed, and slowly the distance between us began to decrease. When I was nearly in formation, the rear man shifted in his flight path, and to my terror, printed on his tail was a black German cross. I was outnumbered. There were three of them. I was outgunned. I was deep within enemy territory. But they hadn't seen me yet, so I thought I might try a shot. I put my sights upon the rear man. I squeezed the trigger. I saw him burst to flames, and he went in a great black spiral down to the earth. I'd had my crowded hour, and I had claimed a victory. But I did not have long to celebrate, for there were two hungry Germans swirling around at me. They chased me for 20 kilometers back to American lines. It was the longest 20 kilometers of my life. I wrote my family a letter rejoicing about my victory. 4 days later was Bastille Day. Bastille Day is the French equivalent of Independence Day. In order to celebrate, as we are doing now, my commanding officer assigned me to organize the day's celebration. I got together a ragtime band. Frenchmen, to this day, are very fond of American ragtime music. We went on patrol. We were supposed to be back at base by noon. However, at noon, 12:15, 12:30, no one knew where I was. What had happened is, as I was going out about patrol, flying around, looking for the Hun, with 2 other Americans, and suddenly we were swarmed by 7 Germans. They were everywhere. At one point, I had 2 in my tail at the same time. I swerved to the left and to the right. I fired my gun when I could. But suddenly, my life was over.
It was here on this veranda that I received the dreadful news that Quentin had been killed in aerial combat over northern France in July of 1918. It's a very somber thing for a father to know that the war that I had so strenuously advocated had led to the death of my youngest son, my dear Quentin. My wife Edith, who was so brave in the weeks and the months after Quentin's death, remarked that you cannot raise a boy to be an eagle and then expect him to behave as a sparrow. Quentin paid with his body for his soul's desire. It's a dreadful thing to see the fine and young gallant youth stricken down in the golden morning of their life. But Quentin died as the heroes of old had died. As brave and fearless men have always risked their lives when a great cause calls. If our country did not contain such men, it would not be our country. Ladies and gentlemen, Quentin Roosevelt.